Julian, what's the address here
136 North 3rd
in Bayfield?
in Bayfield.
Yeah, and how long have you lived here?
We moved up here in 92, so we've been here 17 years.
Yeah, right. And now you're here by yourself.
I'm here by myself.
Yeah, Marie just passed away last month.
Last month.
Yeah, so that must be unusual for you.
Yeah, it's a little different living alone.
How
It
many
takes a while. It takes a little while.
How many years were you married?
3 days short of 61. We were married October 1st, 1948.
That's a long time.
And Marie died on September 27th, 2009.
Yeah. And we're here with Bob Nelson, who's going to serve as a stimulant and a questioner and help to get these stories. Let me pause for a second. Okay, so let's start her off. Should we start with the Stockton or the Rocky Island stuff, Bob? Where do you want to start?
What I would like to do probably is John L. started at Stockton Island, and I'll probably talk a little bit to Dad about telling me about that Presque Stockton Island lifestyle over there. What it's like maybe growing up a little bit there, and then we'll hopefully his father came to America in 1897 type of thing, and tell
Okay.
us John's start. Buying Hans Outsted's rig and all that stuff, Dad. Does that
Okay.
make sense to you?
Yeah, let's roll.
Okay.
I'm recording.
Okay. So I want to start off with the first series of questions. They're going to be slanted towards the old homestead there at Stockton Island, which you spent many a year. But before we get to that stage, I'd like to give the viewers out there a little backdrop as to where our family came from and how they kind of got involved in the fishing industry. And I'd like to go a little bit along the lines from, if I remember right, from the arrival to America to working as a longshoreman to working as a commercial fisherman to buying Hanson Outstead out. So Dad, if you just kind of kick the ball and roll it down the hill here a little bit, tell me a little bit about your dad coming to America.
Well, my father, John Nelson, came to America in March of 1897, and he came from Bergen, Norway, and but primarily from a little island off the coast of Norway named Storable. And and of course, in those days, when you were 14 years old, you were confirmed by the faith of your country, and you were out on your own. So from age 14 until 19, when he arrived in this country, he did some fishing off in the North Sea and up around the Lofoten Islands. And then, of course, things in Norway at that time were very, very rugged and hard. They were nothing like it is today. And so they decided that America was the place to go to. And he already had 3 brothers who had gone to the States. And so he followed them. And because of his brother who had landed in Bayfield 5 years earlier, he decided to come to Bayfield. And he arrived in Bayfield in March of 97. And he was met by a man who became a lifelong friend, a guy by the name of Charlie Benson. And Charlie Benson took him to Sand Island with a dog team, his trunk, and what few belongings he had. And at that time, those foreigners always had a trunk. That's what they carried their meager belongings in. Well, anyway, Charlie got him to Sand Island. It took him all day to get out there and get back before dark. And my father Charlie had arranged for my father to have a job out on Sand Island. And that arrangement was made with a Pete Hanson, who was an old fisherman on Sand Island. And so the first job that my father had was with Pete Hanson on Sand Island, and that Hanson family, relatives, descendants of it, are living here today. From there on, he went to work for the Booth Fisheries, and he got a job on the tugs. And until 1909, he fished on the tugs. No, wait a while. He fished on the tugs for several years, worked on the tugs. And then in 1909, he bought out Hans Auste, who was an old Norwegian who had come to this country earlier. And Hans Auste, I think, was one of the first Norwegians to land in Bayfield. I'm not sure if he was the first or last, but he was one of the first. Mm-hmm. And so my father fished that outfit off of Bear Island until 1918. Then he had met a man by the name of Carl Ludvigsen, and they decided that they would go together and fish partners in 1919 off of Stockton. And Stockton at that time was practically a virgin territory. Very little fishing had been done off of Stockton, and so they looked quite favorably at that site, only to find out later that it was no friend of a northeaster. So in 1918, he and this man Ludvigsen, they built a crib where they figured they were going to have a dock, and they sunk that in the fall. And in 1919, my father and Ludvigsen fished together off Carl's boat, excuse me. That went all right for that year, but my father decided that this wasn't going to last forever. So that winter, he had his own boat built in 1920, and he fished his own outfit from there on until he retired in 1938 off of Stockton. But it went pretty good for a few years, and some differences of opinion and ideas came up, and Carl decided that he didn't want to stay on Stockton at that location anymore. So he was going to move around the point. And of course, what they had there, it was all 50-50. They each owned half of everything. And so the day came when they were going to divide their belongings. And they had one shack together. It probably wasn't over maybe 14 or 16. And they used this shack to live in that first year. So when Ludvigsen, after 1920, well, they each built their own, had their own cabin up on the bank there. But they still owned this little cabin down on the beach. And it was not a cabin, it was a shack. Very primitive.
This was on Stockton Island.
This is on Stockton Island. And so, naturally, Ludvigsen took his house that he was living in on the hill, and moved it around Anderson Point, where he had relocated. But they still owned this cabin or this shack down on the beach, which they called the Twine House. Yeah, they each owned half of that. Mm-hmm. But there was very, very little communication between the two at that time. But my father did mention to him, he says, when you know that you are going to come and take your half of this shack, he says, let me know, because I want to be ready so that I can board up the open hole that you're going to leave. So one day, without any warning at all, here comes one of Carl's men, and he had a handsaw in his hand, and he crawled up on the roof of that cabin, and he started to saw, and he sawed it right down through the roof on both sides. It was a peaked roof, both sides and across the floor, and they threw this part in the water and towed it over. That was settled.
He took his half.
That was his half.
John, just for purposes of documenting that this is a true story,
Yeah.
I have here a photo.
And there's the picture to prove it.
Yeah, here's a nice photo of Gilmore Young, who was a hired man, and he's got probably a 20-pound lean lake trout there in this photo. But if you can zoom in just to the right there a little bit, you'll notice that at this point is the building that's sawed right
I have to go in and get focus here first, because these are kind of critical here.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So you'll notice in this photo, this is the photo of the famous Gilmore Young, who was of the Bataan family Young structure. He's with a couple nice lake trout here. He was working for probably Dad at that time. But here's a nice picture of that twine house that was on the beach. And you can see that after Dad just remarked that John needed somebody there to fill in the hole. You can see this must have been a few days later at least, because the hole is filled in and the cabin is cut right in half there, or the twine house. So that is proof positive that
That is a true story.
in this photo right here, John, you'll see the Nelson cabin up on the hillside there. This photo shows that twine house, I believe, before it was cut in half. So this photo is just a little bit before the photo with Gilmore Young.
I see.
But
Now, what part of Stockton Island is that?
what's that?
Where in Stockton Island is that, Julian?
That is on the northeast corner of Julian Bay.
It'd be on the east side of the island,
On the
facing
east side,
east side of the island, facing Michigan Island, right adjacent and next to the Singing Sands Bay and the bog that were full of the cranberries that you were mentioned to me. That maybe you'll just tell us that story, Dad, about picking cranberries there in the old days.
Well, on the north end of the slough on Stockton, which is just a short ways from where we had the cabin and we could walk to, there was a cranberry field, or whatever you call them, bough, and my mother always wanted a water pail full of cranberries, and they didn't ripen, until late in October. And I remember one year that we went over there and picked them, and of course in those days we wore knee boots, and that bog had frozen over with maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of inch of ice. And we just broke the ice, and the cranberries were right underneath that shelf. But I remember picking them, and boy, was it cold on the hands.
I hope that the reward was that you got some good cranberries for Christmas or Thanksgiving anyway.
Oh yeah, we had cranberries for Thanksgiving and Christmas. But one thing I'd just like to say about Gilmore Young was not fond of that spot, and he called it Alcatraz. He says it's just like being on Alcatraz. And of course, probably a reason that he called it that was because he was a newly married man at that time. And at that time, we used to stay out on the island for 2 weeks at a time. And that was a little too much for a newly married man. But it wasn't long before we changed that old custom to 1 week.
Now, Julian, in those days, obviously this was way before the park, when you went out and put a building up on these islands, did you buy the land?
No,
What was the deal? You just went out
Yeah,
there
you
and
just went out and
Slotted.
you took a spot, and if you needed a tree, you went and took it, and nothing was said.
nobody said anything.
But if I remember right, didn't you mention that you rented that property from?
The property towards the latter years, we paid rent for it.
You did.
Yeah, to the
you-
Vilas estate. Yeah, but and before that, there was also a Mrs. Lewis who lived down around White River, who owned it, and I think the rent was something like $10 a year.
Uh-huh.
And that's what my father paid. But I don't even remember paying the Vilas estate anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Johnny Frostman had an agreement out there too with the Vilas people, and in 1936 it was between Mary Esther Vilas Hanks and Harry Butler, who were trustees of that particular estate. I'm trying to find out here what they paid, but it was probably in Dad's category. No, Dad, in 1936 they paid $25 and no $100
Oh.
a year
Yeah.
to
1930. Well, that would have been my father paying that then.
yeah, so
Uh-huh.
it ranged in those prices from there. So I got these notes from a good friend of ours, which is Marcy Frostman, and she's the wife of the late Jimmy Frostman and the Johnny Frostman people that were at Anderson's Point many years ago. So it's really pretty important information. I have a nice photo here of Julian as a kid. You know, I would say that this photo with his
Oh, two sisters.
yeah. Well, this is kind of shows
Try
the
to hold it sort of straight up and down, Bob. There we go.
it's a photo of the doc and Dad as a kid there. You probably look like you're about 10 years old, so that would be about
Could be.
taken about 1926. And he's with his sisters Eunice on the left and Mildred on the right.
And where is this?
This is at Julian Bay, the same spot.
About what year?
I would say 1926. And then, believe it or not, Dad's moving into his mid-90s now. Probably 94 in March, and at one time he was quite a bit younger. And I have a nice photo of him as he grew up a little bit. He's at the net reels, and you know, for the people that knew him as a captain on the ferry lines for all those years, Dad actually fished a fair amount of his life as a commercial fisherman until 1962, but that's a nice photo of him at the net reels at Stockton Island.
Just hold on to it. Yeah, that's great.
There's a lot of activity in that photo.
The old days, Julian.
Yeah, but we have to remember one thing too. When Ludvigsen moved that cabin, this was, I would say, about 1932 or 3, just in the heart of the Depression, when a dollar really was counted several times before you let it go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the time when the fish price dropped to 5 cents a pound for beautiful, nice, lean lake trout.
Okay.
Dad, can you take a little more time here and tell us Hans Austed, I believe if I read right in the past, he moved up here from Eau Claire in about 1885.
It could be.
And he also, he fished and he was a carpenter, and but he also had a spot at Outer Island. You remember that Hans Austed Bay? And,
Well, it's named after Hans Austed. As far as I know, he never really fished off of Outer Island, but they used that as a waypoint, and they would pull up, and he would pull up his sailboat on one of the flat rocks and stay overnight or go there. Yeah, but he never had a permanent house or a permanent campsite. But for that reason, that bay became known as Hans Austed Bay.
what happened
Yeah.
in the earliest days of commercial fishing was right around from 1885 to about 1906. There was a period in time where there were only steam tugs in Bayfield,
Yeah.
and they were owned by Solly Batan, Frank Batan Sr. Booth came to Bayfield in 1883, and they brought their tugs with, and there were no gasoline boats in Bayfield
No.
until about 1905, in that period in time when the first gasoline boats came here. So what happened was, is indications are that many fishermen went to the islands, parked on the island, had their own sailboat. Then the steam tugs, like the R.T. Roy and Nelson and those boats would haul their gill nets out for them and their supplies. They'd leave them on the beach, the guys that go fishing. Then these guys would come back a little bit later, the captains on those particular tugs. Like prior to the C.W. Turner, probably the Barker and the Curry and
Yeah.
those tugs went out there and picked up the fish.
Yeah.
So they fished out of Mackinac, outside of Outer Island. They fished outside the islands in those days like that. And then they'd come into Bayfield at periodic times. So it was a different lifestyle versus now where
Yeah.
the commercial fishermen come back to their port of entry every night.
Yeah.
Bear Island was kind of an interesting little place.
Yes, it was. But I have no memories of Bear Island because from 1909 till 1919, that's where my father fished off of for those years. And of course, I was born in 16, so I have no memory of Bear Island. But my sisters have a very good memory of it, and they had a little playhouse, and it was fun for them for the formative years.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a photo of that place at Bear Island, John, if you're interested.
Yeah.
And I'll take it out of here. And two photos, actually. Let me get it out of here. This photo is a family photo taken at Bear Island. As you can see, the cabins weren't much.
No.
And I know that, and maybe Dad, you want to tell that story about Grandma Nelson just going to the island once a year, and she'd make the dresses out there for all the kids and stuff.
Yeah. Yes, well, I had 5
So
sisters.
where was this cabin?
This was at Bear Island.
This is the cabin that my grandfather had at Bear Island.
Yeah. And I had 5 sisters, and my mother was quite a seamstress, and those 5 girls had to have dresses to start school, new dresses to start school in the fall. And my mother would send, and she had brought her sewing machine out there, the foot treadle sewing machine out on the island, and she would send my oldest sister to town to buy bolts of material and bring it to Bear Island, and she would sew dresses in her spare time for these 5 girls who were going to go to school in the fall.
In this photo, John, this young lady to the left here is Dad's older sister, Olive Sonora Nelson, but she'd probably roll over in her grave if I ever gave her middle name away again. But she's in this photo right here, and this is at Bear Island, where probably the Turner had landed.
Yeah.
This is the dock, and people in those days had a lot of company. People would visit on the Turner, and
Oh, yeah.
and all the boats would come and pick up the fish, and they'd bring ice and milk and the pork and whatever you needed, whatever you didn't have there, they'd run that to the island for you.
Yeah.
This is a real nice photo of Ollie. She's probably 10 or 11 years old here, so I'd say this is about 1924, somewheres in there, Dad.
Yeah.
And
Could
so,
be. Yeah.
and the rest of these people, we don't know who they are for sure. It's just,
No.
I wish my Aunt Ranghill would have been around, John, because
Yeah.
Rags would have known who they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the trouble.
I have a lot of photos that I wish my old Uncle Fred Benson were back too to help
Yeah.
distinguish
yeah,
who people
Fred
were.
could have told a lot about the early days.
So, from Bear Island over to Stockton Island.
Yeah.
I know that there's one little stint in there, Dad, where I want to get into moving the cabin from Presqu'île in a second, but that wasn't the first move of that cabin.
No.
Maybe you'll tell that little story about where the cabin was at Anderson's Point,
Oh, yeah.
and fill in for us some of the blanks as to
Yeah.
where that originally came from, the history of this cabin,
Yeah.
and we'll go from there.
Well, that cabin that we're talking about now, which is now on Rocky Island, was built by the Booth Fisheries in the middle 1880s. And they used it for their fishing operation off of Stockton during the tug days, when my father was working on the tugs.
What year would this be about?
This would be in the early 1900s, from 1900 until about 1909, because that's when my father left the Booth Fisheries and went on his own. And that cabin is where he took his new bride, whom he had married in 1903, because he was working for Booth, and he took her out there because he was working out there. And when she got out there and saw the cabin that he had brought her to, she just stood back and said, "How could you do this to me?" And she was very justified in saying that, because the cabins that they used in those days were nothing but shacks. You know, you could throw cats through the cracks in the walls and the windows.
Well, I think there was a little bit of pressure on him at that point in time to upgrade it.
Yeah.
So the original photos of this is just like my dad said. It shows that cabin pretty in tough shape.
Yeah.
There's a one photo at home, Dad, of you and Ollie there where
Yeah.
there's a door over here, and it's pretty pathetic.
So
But I think over a period of time, the improvement started to show.
yeah, but
It's this one.
So when he went on his own in 1920, he just went to Anderson Point and took that cabin. And as far as I know, he never approached Booth Fisheries or anybody. It had sat there for a few years. So he took it and moved it over to the northeast corner of Julian Bay. And then in 1938,
Well, how did he do that?
he just threw it in the water and towed it over.
He just pulled it down the
He
bank.
pulled it down the bank and towed it.
So he floated the whole cabin behind what boat?
The twin.
Behind the first boat he owned was a twin.
Yeah, yeah,
So around the point it went. Then they pulled it up on the beach,
yeah, up at the hill.
on the rocks actually. That's
On the rocky beach. Yeah, and pulled it up on the hill and located it there.
And that was there from 1919
Yeah,
to when you moved it to Rocky.
yeah. And I moved it to Rocky in 1947, because I had bought my father out in 38. And in between those years, we rebuilt it. We finished it with sheetrock and new siding and new windows, and put a sun porch on it, and it looked then just like it looks not today. Now, and then in 47, when I decided to buy property on Rocky Island, I wasn't going to leave it there. We made every attempt to move it, and we moved it. Took it on a barge.
I want to get into that right now a little bit. And John, if you can zoom here, you will see that this photo is, there's a boat here, there's a cabin on it, there's a porch on it, and the barge is over to the right hand.
Let me get in here. It's kind of critical focus here. Okay.
You'll notice there's water, there's a boat, there's a cabin, there's a porch, and underneath the porch is a barge.
Yeah.
On the front of the boat is is June Tommy Thompson, who was working with Dad then. I'm going to throw the ball back to Dad now, though.
Yeah.
And I'm going to really critique this because it was a very, very interesting story. In fact, it was so interesting that when I sent a photo of this to a National Park Service retired regional office person, he said he'd never, ever heard of a cabin being moved by water in any of the national parks that he'd ever been involved in. So he was thrilled to get it. Well, let's back up a minute.
Yeah. Well,
What happened, Dad? Why did you decide to move to Rocky? Let's get that out of the way, and then we'll talk about the painstaking efforts and the leaking boats and everything
well,
else.
yeah. It was in 1947 when Olaf Edwards, an old fisherman from Rocky Island, decided to sell his property. And I became interested in it, so we made a deal and I bought that property from him. And then, of course, the project of moving came up. And so I got Halvor Wrighton, who owned the railway mechanism for hauling out boats. He had a big barge. That barge, I suppose, was 30 feet long, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I took him out to Stockton, showed him the cabin and what was up, and he says, we'll try it. He says, I think we can move it. So back to Bayfield we go, and we get the barge and a couple other guys. And
who was with you?
Well, I'll tell you who was with me. There was me, Tommy Thompson, Van Ashman, Bill Noring, and Halvor Wrighton. Mm-hmm.
That was the dream team in them days?
Yeah, that was the team that moved the cabin. So everything was going good, but we had this hill to go down, and we had two 12x12s under. Everything was grunt labor. There was no machinery.
Lots of grease.
Lots of grease. Yeah.
On the skidways.
Yeah, to slide that cabin on, and we inched it over with a hand winch in low gear, inch at a time. And then, of course, we had to turn it around and take it down the bank. And we had a good heavy inch manila line on it to hold it back, and we had several wraps on a birch tree back there.
That was a good story.
And down the bank we started with it, and pretty soon it started to gain momentum. And I remember yet, Halvor hollering, hold her, everything's in favor of total collapse. Yeah, and so Tommy was paying out the rope, and so he fetched up on those turns on that tree, and the birch bark came off of the tree. But he stopped the cabin. He held the cabin, and we let it down the rest of the way, and we got it on the barge. And it had been blowing a gale out of the west that day, and I figured, oh boy, it'd be a good night to take it, because the west wind at that time of the year always went down at night.
What month was it?
That was in July.
In July.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we loaded it, but what we didn't know, but we soon found out that out in the middle of the lake there was a northeaster coming, and we had no idea about that. But we started out, and we just got a couple blocks away from the dock, and these big rollers from the north. The rollers came ahead of the wind, and we were headed into those big rollers, and it wasn't long before we found out that there was no way we could get her around Stockton Island. So we turned around, brought her back, and by that time we had her so full of water that the cabin was in danger of being just floated off.
The boat was full of water.
The barge was full of water.
Too.
Yeah, the barge was full of water. And so the only thing we could do was to get the barge back on the rocks, haul it up as far as we could with the winch, and then pull the cabin back off and go to town and repair the barge, which we did. And we had that barge was all twisted, from all that activity, especially trying to ride a northeast swell on the rocky beach. So, but we fixed it up, got it going again, and we started out again. And this time it went real smooth. I mean, we had a real nice evening, and in about 2 hours we had it over to over to Rocky Island, ready to be unloaded, and no problems over there. And we just slid it off and up to where it was until '01 when we moved it down to its present location. Mm-hmm. So that cabin has been on 4 locations in its lifetime. But I think now it's at the last location.
And in 2003,
Yeah.
we had a kind of like an all Nelson reunion at Rocky Island, because that would have been the 100th year at that time. Dad determined that our family had personally been inhabiting that cabin for 100 years, so we kind of had a major fun party at Rocky Island.
Yeah.
And kind of celebrated that.
Yeah.
The history of that cabin moving from the northern section of the piece of property that Dad owned at the time, which is about 800 feet of property. It was on the north end of it.
Yeah.
It came to our attention as in 1974 we'd signed some leases with the park, and part of the deal was when they annexed the property through the use and occupancy situation. We no longer owned the property, and we were given a stipend. Well, at that point in time, Dad came to us, to my sister Heidi and myself, and said, well, what do you kids want to do? And Heidi and I said, we'd like to keep the property where the dock is at. And there were some cabins there that were built by the Edwards family, and the twine houses and stuff that Dad had purchased from Olaf in 1947. So all that was in place, but the one cabin that was there is the nice cabin that they brought over from Stockton, and that was probably 800 feet away from there. Well, in that period of time, Dad not only gave Heidi and I the use and occupancy property, but he also chunked out the middle parcel to John Chapin, who was a friend of ours in the family for many years, from the early 50s. He was also conservation warden, John, and then my aunt and uncle, Bob and Olive Jones. And they had access to that north piece of property. Well, they didn't use the use and occupancy. They took a 25-year lease, and that expired in 1999. So at that point in time, the property and everything that was on it now became the property of the United States government, the people. So kind of a dilemma came about is I was walking down the beach. Dad and I went out there to clean out the building. Remember that, Dad?
Yeah.
We were hauling all that stuff, and my hips were bad, and I was thinking to myself, if the park gets a hold of this, and if it goes into disrepair like much of the other properties that they'd had since day one, it had gone into squalor. I thought, I just don't want this to happen. It's an old booth building. It was built in about 1883, 85, somewhere in there. Made for enduring trips, and I said we're going to try at least to pick up this piece of property or the cabin that was on it and move from there. So what we did then was we had a little conversation with Jerry Banta and said, I'm agreeable to that. And
Who's Jerry Banta?
Jerry Banta was then the superintendent of the National Park Service. And then Jerry up and left, and he went to Arches National Park down in Arizona someplace. And in comes John Neal, who was the superintendent of the park at that point in time. So we knew that the park was selling the property, so Heidi and I and Dad threw in a bid. Remember that, Dad? For $500.
$500.
And then, and so the cabin was $500, and Robert Murado and Kathy Murado bid $200 for my Uncle Norman's cabin, which was also taken over there from Stockton Island as a part of that deal. And well, to make a long story short, we had submitted the bid, and then we went up to the National Park Service and said to John Neal, he said, well, you know what we'd like to do is see if it's okay with you. He said, we said to him, John, we'd like to buy that cabin and move it down to our use and occupancy property about 800 feet away. To that, he says, the cabin is yours, you got the bid. He said, but I can't do that. And I said, what's the problem, John? And John said, he said, it's interesting, it's a nice piece of property and all these things, but what would happen then is that if you own that cabin privately, he said, then we'd have a private cabin on federal property, and we can't allow that to happen. Well, I said, that's easy to remedy. And he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, when we move the cabin down, I says, the family will write a letter to you, thereby gifting that cabin, of my grandparents' cabin, back to the people of the United States. Oh. So he said, that makes sense. And so he allowed that to happen. And then in 2001, we had the friends like Randy Erickson, Jeff Patan, a whole pile of people from Bayfield that went out there that day. Tom Kovacevic, and I don't want to really slight anybody by not mentioning them here, but there was
a real nice, good bunch of guys.
Yeah, we got the Outer Island out there. Randy Erickson and C&W Construction at that point in time donated a backhoe, a bulldozer, and a front end loader, and we decided to move the cabin. So one of the interesting things there on that day was it was Memorial Day weekend. It was a gray, cloudy day, and I said, boy, am I going to go for this. I'm just praying to see that Outer Island come around Hardwood.
Yeah.
And when I saw it coming, we were there the night before kind of prepping things and getting the building jacked up and all kinds of things underneath it. When I saw the Outer Island coming with Randy Erickson running it, and that crew of people and all that gear on there, I felt relieved because now we could save this building. Yeah. And I didn't trust it right till then. I thought, boy, I'm just waiting for the part to come out here and put the kibosh to it, which they didn't. So anyway, Randy and the group arrived, and I got some beautiful photos of that. We jacked the building up on that Saturday morning.
Yeah.
And on the front end of it, Randy Erickson had a 690 John Deere front end backhoe,
yeah.
And behind it his brother Robbie was with it. So what we've done is we jacked the building up and we put 3 large trees that I'd taken off another piece of property I own, and we slid them under and we bolted it together and put some front pieces on it, and Randy Erickson lifted it up much like you'd lift. We had a chain on one corner and a chain on the other, and then we got worried a little bit about that porch falling off because the only thing that's underneath it is just a 1x4. So Dad said, well, we'll do what we did before. And so I'm gonna flip that little story over to Dad, and then I'll finish up my end of it here. So about.
Yeah. Well, when Halva Wrighton looked at it on Stockton, I says, do we have to take the porch off? And he says, Lee looked at it and he says, no, we don't have to take the porch off. He says, we'll just put a couple of 2x4s inside on the wall, right close to the ceiling, and we'll put some eye bolts in that, and then we'll put cables in 4 places down to the outside stringer of that porch. And he says, we'll tighten it up and it'll ride perfect. And which it did. It even went through that northeaster that we had it in for an hour. And we did the same thing when we moved it down the beach on Rocky. Mm-hmm. And the holes in that porch are still there. It'll show where we had the eye bolts in, and also on the wall of the cabin.
An interesting caveat to that story,
yeah,
is that we used the identical bolts. We used the same process.
Yeah.
We lifted the building up, and we had to set it back once to readjust the chain so that it would go down the beach level. Yeah. So what we done, now Randy Erickson is on the front end of the backhoe, and he picks it up, knuckles up, and just starts to take off, just like this. Down the beach we go. 45 minutes later, we had it in place, parallel parked, and by lunch hour, we had the building jacked up with all the stuff underneath it ready to go, except we needed to build a little stoop porch for it. So what would probably take the rest of the world months and years, maybe if the park did it years, we did it in 45 minutes, hauled it down the beach, and we never broke a window.
No.
Never. There wasn't one thing out of joint. And Randy Erickson did a masterful job of taking it. He had 6 inches clearance between 2 buildings. In he went. We moved 3 buildings out of the way, and plus an apple tree we dug out.
Yeah.
And we parallel parked it, moved back the twine shed down there, Dad.
Yeah.
And planted the tree, and this was all done before lunch.
Yeah.
And then we went over and we got Lori Nurse's cabin, which was on the other side of the property just south of us. And we allowed Lori and the Nurse family to bring that cabin on our property to use to pretty much posterity.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that little interesting side note to
Yeah.
Now,
this wonderful little cabin that came from Anderson's Point to Julian Bay to the north section of our property down to the south section. So
Yeah.
she's pretty well traveled.
Yeah.
and now, how long is the Rocky property going to be in the family? Now?
The property at Rocky will be it's in my sister Heidi's and my name. We have that use and occupancy lease, and when the day that Heidi and I pass, then the federal government, United States National Park Service, Pass Islands National Lakeshore, under the Department of the Interior, then will take hold of the property.
Yeah, right.
What we've done in between, though, is we knew that this is a special piece of property, at least in our hearts, and we always felt that this would be a special piece of property for the people many years to come. I've always felt that it's really important that young people, old people, people that come to these islands later in periods of time will realize what it was to be a commercial fisherman in the island, to realize what it is to be a Norwegian, to realize what it is to live as the hard work and the sweat equity that went into those businesses. So we've retained that property to about the 1937 look, except for the gas lights we put in, which is cheating a little bit. But everything else is pretty much the way it was in 1937. We thought that was what we wanted to do.
So it's a historic site, really.
Yeah, with that in mind, a friend of ours, Robert Mackrith and Brady Benson, funded a study of that property, and Brady spent about $10,000 of his own money. And the Park Service employed 2 people, one of which was Bob Mackrith, and they started the work to put that property plus the southern property, which is Mal Erickson's, Jack Erickson, Brenda, Marty, and Sharon Erickson's property, all the way to the Headlands, into a National Historic District. That National Historic District became real 1 year ago, so that property now, about a mile and a half of property there, is now National Historic District within the wilderness of the Gaylord Nelson Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. So to Brady Benson and Bob Mackrith, the Nelson family is forever indebted for that move.
Yeah. And Julian, so that place out at Rocky is close to your heart.
Oh, yes.
You know, what does it mean to you, that place?
Well,
I know you haven't. When was the last time you went out there?
Well, September 24th of this past year, I was invited out, or maybe I invited myself to. At least I didn't say no when they asked me. Well, the way it came about was that the Heritage Foundation was looking for money, and they were raffling off or bargaining off certain things for anybody to bid on. And Jerry Phillips, he paid for a trip to Rocky Island, and a group of us went out there, and Bob and Heidi fixed everybody a wonderful fish dinner, and we thank Jerry Phillips for his generous donation to the Bayfield Heritage Association.
I'll just,
Well, let me get back though to your connection to that place, Julian.
What?
Let me back to your own personal connection to that place, because you
My personal?
yeah.
Well,
to Rocky. And,
I have a connection to that since the time I was able to walk when it was on Stockton Island. I went out there in the summertime, and as a very young boy, I was engaged in the fishing, helping my dad with the net fixing. And I started to work for him when I was only 12 years old, and he took me on the lake then. And so I have a connection to that little cabin for many, many years. And it was, I would have felt real bad if that cabin had been destroyed.
yeah.
They can do something with it after I'm gone. But
No, did you spend every summer out there? Just
Oh,
stayed out there
yes.
all summer, or did?
yeah, well, we fished off of there during the summertime and till late in the fall. But of course, we never spent any time there in the wintertime.
Yeah.
No.
you moved to Rocky Island in 1947,
Yeah.
and then you got out of the fishing industry in 1962. So
Yeah.
I believe that for those years that
Yeah.
that was my formative years. I was born in 1950, so I remember as a little kid, going to the island. And that story about Mal Erickson having to come to town to get me milk out there and stuff like that, or that's why the Erickson family is, we've been lifelong friends with the Erickson family, and
Yeah.
you could write a story, you could do a whole story on Mal Erickson's stories, John. I mean, he's that great a guy and was that popular a guy, and his son
remember Mal.
Jack too, and that bunch. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking, Dad, tell me a little bit about the earliest days when were you there when Olaf left in 46 and you showed up in the spring of 47. What was it like when you got there?
Well,
The dock was there?
the dock was there, but one thing I can say, after I retired in 1980, I went out there with Mel, and I know I did a lot of work in those from 80 to 90 to 95, because in the meantime, that property had been neglected, because I left the fishing there in 62, so there was 15, 18 years where that piece of property had not had any attention, even though my sister was out there on the north end of the property living in that cabin. But down by the dock, the fish house that was there, and the twine house, and various other
Cork
things.
rack.
The cork rack, and everything had just deteriorated.
The linseed
because-
oil cabin.
the linseed oil cabin, that had all deteriorated. So there was a lot of things to do to bring it back. And then, but of course, by 1990, 95, we had it back to pretty good shape again.
In 1978,
We also rebuilt the dock
twice now.
twice now.
So
So
we got thousands of dollars stuck into that. The dock was rebuilt in 1978.
yeah,
That was another deal where Ed Erickson and Richard,
Yeah.
Randy, and a whole pile of guys, David Galazin, John Hunt.
Bucky Batan.
Yeah, we were all out there and rebuilt the top of the dock.
Yeah,
Then in 2005, I believe it was, we were back out there again. And, we put a crib on then, added a crib, and then
yeah,
this last time out, we replaced pretty much the whole top of the dock and added another 100 yard of rock into it and that type of thing. So
yeah.
that should stand up to the
During
seas
the-
for many years.
During the time that I was gone from 62 till 1980, one of the cribs on the old dock had disappeared, and so that's when we had to build a new crib and put on. So,
A lot of history out there.
a lot of history, yeah.
I mean, the Rocky Island as an island, basically it's one of the first, I think it is the first island that ever had fish camps on it. A lot of people kind of know it, but a lot of people really don't know it, that the commercial fishery out here was set up by American Fish Company in about 1836. The fur trades had gone to heck, that type of thing, and so they were looking for ways to make some money, and they got into this fish business. So that point in time, I think is the Ramsey Clark was charge of American Fur Company, and he had a guy by the name of Charles Borup that went to Rocky Island in 1839, and he had, there's evidence to this date that he had a large fish camp at the south end of two islands that were called Flat Island 12 and 13. Flat Island 13, the record books say, it was also known as Ironwood Island. On my abstract that I have at home from, that is dated 1862, it says Rice's Island, which was really purchased by Henry M. Rice from a patent from the United States government. At that point in time, it also said Rice's Island, Rocky Island, also known as Ironwood Island. So there's great evidence that around the Sandpoint at Rocky Island, 1839, the first fish camps of the Apostle Islands were set forth there by the American Fur Company. So it's just, Rocky Island has been a natural harbor. It's been the home, and we'll probably get into this if Dad's in the mood here in a minute, to a number of fishermen, starting with Hans Ousted, John Freed, Chris Tadland, Mike Hendrickson, Charlie Benson, Julian Nelson, Olaf Edwards, Ole Olson, Laurie Nurse Sr., Ted Neese,
Louis Olson.
Well, let's just, let me get over here to Julian. Let's just throw some names, as you said.
Let's go with it, Dad.
What's that?
You want a glass of water yet, or?
No,
You want to take a break?
no, I don't need a break. Do you?
No. Tell us a little bit about John Freed.
John Freed?
Yeah. Do you remember
What?
much?
Well, John Freed was one of the fishermen on Willie's Island that moved to Rocky when Linus Jacobson bought Willie's Island, and there was two other fishermen that eventually moved too, Olaf Edwards and Charlie Benson. But John Freed was one of the first, and he occupied where Mel is now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he lived in that tool shack. That's where he lived, and his wife, she kind of paid attention to what he was doing, and especially when he was on Willie's. And I remember somebody telling me that every time John came in off of the lake from lifting his nets, she would come down to the dock and she'd look in the boat and see how much fish he had. And if he didn't have much that day, she would just say, "No good fisherman," and walk up the dock again. Yeah, that's...
Well, John Freed was, there's some nice photos of him at
Yeah.
Bayfield Heritage Association.
Yeah.
But he was there. I've read where he was also at South Twin in about 1910, along with Olaf Edwards and John Duva, Henry Johnson Sr.,
Yeah.
and the Bensons were there.
And the Bensons were there.
But the big move came, the big troubles started when Linus Jacobson purchased South Twin.
Yeah.
In about, what is it, 1930?
Yeah, about that. Maybe 31, 32, somewhere's in there. Yeah, and he raised the rent up for them and they left.
And they came across to
And
Rocky.
they moved, and that's when they moved to Rocky. Benson, Olaf Edwards, John Freed. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Chris Tadland, Dad. Give me a story that you might have of old Chris.
Well, I don't know too much about Chris. He was a very soft-spoken man. Yeah, I don't think he ever said a bad word, but a hard worker. Yeah, and
He had the boys Harvey and Clifford,
yeah.
and I know that his wife Olga was one of the great cooks that there ever was.
Oh yeah.
You couldn't walk up the beach
Yeah. Oh,
without getting a feed.
Yeah, she always had something. Yeah.
What do you remember about Mike Hendrickson, Dad? As we're going from the north end of the island to the south end of the island now.
Well, Mike was after Hans Salsa left there, I think probably Mike was the next one that moved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and at that time, Ole Olson was on Bear Island. He was fishing off of where your grandfather fished.
Late 1930s.
Yeah, and then Ole moved over to Rocky too, because he and Mike were kind of fishing together during the war years there.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ted Neese came along, and he had been on Madeline Island for a while. He came from North Dakota, settled on Madeline, and then he carved out a spot on Rocky.
On the south end.
On the south end, right.
So there was quite a community out there.
Oh, yes.
Well,
At one time, there was quite a few boats there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there was, as you go from north to south, it would be Chris Tadlin, Mike Hendrickson,
Yeah. Then what came,
Charlie Benson,
yeah.
Julian Nelson, and Olaf Edwards on that property. Martin Erickson and Mel Erickson. Actually, Martin bought that property
Yeah.
in 1940 of the Erickson property from Olaf Edwards.
Yeah.
And then below that was Louis Olson.
Mm-hmm.
Below that was Ole Olson.
Yeah.
Below that was Laurie Nurse Sr. and Grace, Rocky Island Air Haven.
Yeah.
Ted Neese, and then Grace Nurse's grandfather, Mr. Butler from Superior, was on the Sandpoint down there in around the bend in probably property where old Eddie Batan had his homestead when he fished from the 1870s to the turn of the century there. So Rocky has always been a fishing community.
Yeah.
Haul your own water, that's the motto.
Yeah.
So let's take 2 seconds here. I need a little glass of water. Can we, John?
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
take a break.
Okay. An era or a period in time in the of the history of Bayfield that there hasn't been very much printed about, although every now and then it is alluded to. And that is the time around 1900, before and after, when Bayfield was a pretty active and thriving community. And history tells us that there was around 2,000 people. And it was in the boom days of the logging industry, and the fishing industry was going good. And these people also had a life. And there were no such a thing as a bar in those days. They were called saloons. And there was 10 or 12 of them scattered throughout the community. And they can be pinpointed today pretty much too, from that vacant lot across from the ferry line next to Harbor's Edge where Ed Baldwin's Bucket of Blood was. And that's what they called it, to the first and last chance, which was across from the depot, where you had got the first chance to get a drink when you got off the train, the last chance to have a drink before you got on the train.
And where was the depot in those days?
The depot was right across from where the chamber office is now. That's where the depot was. And on that vacant lot was the first and last chance. And
And what about in between the two bars? You remember some of the others?
what about what?
What about some of the other saloons in between the beginning and the end? You
Well,
remember
I don't
those?
know the names of those. I have never
there were
heard
a
the
bunch
name.
of 'em.
But these are the two that stand out. The Bucket of Blood and the First and Last Chance. But there was also something else in Bayfield that only is alluded to. And that was the house that was located up on Jimmy Erickson's farm, where the young ladies with the high heel shoes and the lipstick took care of the loneliness that had existed amongst the lumberjacks. Very little has ever been
Yeah.
printed of that era. And-
Was there only one brothel here?
As far as I know.
Yeah.
And I remember the lady, the madam. Yeah. But of course, she was an elderly lady when I was made aware of her, and
Yeah.
I was very young then. But I do remember her.
You remember her name?
Well, I don't know if I should publish it.
Oh, I'm sure it's in the
Yeah, well,
historical
she's
record.
not around anymore.
You can't object anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, it was Ole Selfer's wife. Yeah. The man that Jimmy Erickson bought the property from.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So,
So that was
Jimmy
it.
might have something to say about that too. But
There's an interesting that in that period of time. You don't need to pan on me, John, but I'm gonna get Dad to tell this story.
Yeah.
There was a young lady that came from Norway to Bayfield, Wisconsin. That would be my grandmother, Andrea.
yeah,
And Dad, I'd like you to spend a few minutes and tell a little bit about her history coming to Bayfield
yeah,
and what it was like for her when she got off the train at the depot
yeah.
in Bayfield.
Yeah.
Please tell us that story.
Yeah, well, I was going to get to that, but one of my sisters, oh, she wasn't too old, probably in her teens, yeah, approached my mother one day and said to her, Ma, I'll bet you were real glad when you left Norway and got to Bayfield and left that old country. And my mother looked at her in total disbelief. And she says, you don't know what you are talking about. She says, what I left was a nice, clean little city with cobblestones and neatly cared for houses and homes. And when I got to Bayfield, there was nothing but muddy streets and drunken lumberjacks.
And cows.
And cows in the streets. Animals in the streets. Well, of course, you want to remember now, Bayfield at that time was only 40-some years old.
She got here in 1899.
She got here in
It was
1890.
really a frontier town.
It was exactly a frontier town. Exactly. Yeah. And you don't hear that mentioned. But that's what it was.
When she arrived, you know,
Yeah.
she would have come on the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha.
Yeah.
And that would have been her route. And they were pretty nice for their time. I think they were pretty nice, coach
Yeah.
cars. But when she got off
Yeah.
and took a look up, it would have been Broad Street
Yeah.
and Manypenny Avenue is where that would have been. Broad Street and Manypenny. And when she looked up there wasn't that fancy cobblestone that came years later. It wasn't this nice asphalt we have this day and age. It was nothing but Lake Superior mud and silt.
Yeah.
And it was just beyond a gunfighter town. There's many stories documented of the fist fights and the knife fights and the gun battles and the stuff that you'll find in the old Bayfield County presses. And if you really look into the Bayfield Progress, you'll see that was really a period of time when there was a lot of nastiness going on.
Yeah.
And it got so bad here that in 1915, the vote was, this is before Prohibition, but Bayfield was dry in 1915, where they absolutely shut the bars down. And that was the year that Henry Walksmith came into power, Dad.
Is that right? Yeah.
Doc Mertens was the mayor. The Bayfield set itself off from the town of Bayfield in 1913. And the first mayor was Dr. Mertens.
Yeah.
And Mertens...
Was it Mertens or Pickett?
Pickett.
Pickett,
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Doc-
Pickett. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Dr.
Dr.
Pickett. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Pickett's the mayor.
Yeah.
And in this period of time, the town went from 11 bars in 1914 down to 8. So they were starting to control the flow. But it wasn't enough. And there was this temperance group in Bayfield that put it to the electorate by referendum to banish all liquor in Bayfield. So what happened then was they took the vote in April, and then the temperance people won by, I think it was 39 votes. So the town is now dry, and and Pickett didn't do a very good job because he was allowing blind pigs in Bayfield to operate. And so the local people went after him mercilessly, and at that point in time, H.J. Walksmith, Henry Walksmith was living in the 3rd Ward, and he was a 3rd Ward alderman. Pickett resigned, and at that point in time, the council put Henry Walksmith into the mayorship, and I don't know exactly how many years, I'm not that far along the line now, but that was a story of, that was a real nasty period in time politically in Bayfield.
Well, Dr. Pickett was considered a healthy drinker, so there was probably some reason he didn't push too hard to get rid of.
Well, he had the people like Halvor Hermanson, who was he was operating the bar at the First and Last Chance. They were all in cahoots.
Yeah.
And so they had formed their little teams in Bayfield, or cliques or groups, and
But I remember Dr. Pickett, and I remember the talk about how he liked to have a drink.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you hoped when you needed him, he hadn't had a few.
Yeah. 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 And I know my mother, when she saw that, I know she said afterwards that if she hadn't gotten so darn seasick coming across it, at that time, I guess it took 10 days or 2 weeks to cross the ocean. But she couldn't stand the water. She thought, maybe I should go back home.
To Norway?
Go back home to Norway.
Yeah.
But there was another thing too, about my mother that I guess we don't talk about it much, but
Her name was Andrea Nelson.
but her mother, Grandma Thompson, my grandmother, left my mother in Norway when she was only 12 years old. And my mother went to live with my great-grandfather. Yeah. So
Ole Sigbjørnsen.
Ole Sigbjørnsen. So there was, my mother was 18 when she got, so there was 6 years that my mother lived with her grandfather.
And why did she do that?
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know why Grandma Thompson, but Grandma Thompson had relatives in this country then. And she had come to Bayfield, or she came to this country in 1893. So, and the reason my mother came to Bayfield was because her mother was here then. Yeah, so.
What happened prior to that, I think Bertina, who we're talking about, is Andrea's mother.
Yeah.
Was born in about 1856.
Yeah.
To Ole Sigbjørnsen, who was born in about 39 or somewhere in there.
Yeah.
What happened was she fell in love with this guy by the name of Jacobson.
Yeah.
I think it was his name.
Jacob. Oh. I can't.
She was married to a guy by the name of Jacobson.
Yeah.
And
right.
so my grandmother's real name is Andrea Jacobsen in Norway. Michael Bernt Jacobsen was her father.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael Bernt.
And she married, and her mother was Bertina Sigbjørnsen. They married. Michael Bernt died probably in 1891 for some reason.
Yeah.
They had 3 children together. One was, Andrea was the oldest. She had a sister named Georgina, who died real young in life, and a brother, Jacob. So those 2 were living there. I don't know what happened after that, but since Grandma was born in 1883? 1881.
1881.
In 1893, she was about 12 years old.
Yeah.
Bertina lost her husband, and she took up with this guy by the name of John Tonneson. And they came to America, and his name was John Thompson in America. So I think she probably said, Oldie, grandfather, can you take care of my children till I get my life together? You know, is the way it would be. And she came to America with him in '93, and Grandma came 6 years later. But it was probably a terrible burden for my grandmother, because not only was she the oldest, but I was sure she would probably had to take care of possibly Oldie to some degree, and then she had a young brother and sister, so she was a parent at the age of 12 and 13, and probably not feeling good about that when she got here.
No, she didn't.
And so there was always a pretty big rift between them, wasn't there, Dad?
There was, yeah. There was
no forgiveness.
Yeah, there was no real bond between my mother and her mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know,
and I'm sure it was due to the fact that she had been left there for 6 years on her own.
Pretty much abandoned in her mind.
Yeah.
And you know, it's kind of like if young people in the next generation listen to this tape, you see that going on today.
Yeah.
With parents with poor parenting skills that leave for reasons that the children will never know. Times were very, very tough in the old days too.
Yeah.
They were very, very hard for people.
Yeah.
That, you know, this generation will never understand.
No.
This generation will never understand what it is to have your own garden. And if you wanted to eat in the wintertime, you better have your own garden. You needed to raise your chickens. You needed to do things on your own, and that's the importance of these old stories coming out now. Is
Yeah.
things don't change all that much, but it's much better now.
Yeah.
Dad, one last thing, we'll get you pick your mind here,
Yeah.
and we know that in the fall of the year, for quite a few years now, we've had a wonderful apple fest in Bayfield.
Oh, yeah.
And there's, I would like you just to give the history of, like, when you were in the chamber and who the people that were with you,
Yeah.
and how that whole apple festival, Bayfield Apple Festival, came to be.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell it as I remember it. At that time, this was 1962. And at that time, the tourist season ended in Bayfield pretty much at Labor Day. And when we had that board meeting in our store that night,
Chamber board meeting?
it was a chamber board meeting. What we were trying to come up with was something that would extend the season. Make the season a little longer, because after all, September was a pretty nice month, and and even part of October, and so that got tossed around a little bit. What can we do? And it was Jimmy Erickson who came out with, well, let's try an apple festival. Well, we thought about it for a minute or two and said, sure, what can we do with an apple festival? Well, we decided, and all of this took place in probably half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. Well,
The store was at 205 North 5th Street in
yeah,
Bayfield.
and we were sitting in the back there talking.
Who was with you?
Well, there was myself, Jimmy Erickson, George Mitchell, Dan Brummer, and Melvin Sandstrom. Those guys were on the board at that time. And so, well, what's an apple festival going to do? Well, Mitchell says we should have a parade. Yeah, that sounded pretty good, so we'll go with a parade. But he says, if you have a parade now, he says, and an apple festival, you gotta have an apple queen. And I know just the girl for it. And her name is Mariana. And I will ask her, and I know she'll accept, and I will get the regalia that the Rebeccas use for their ceremonies, and Mary will look like a queen. That was settled in 5 minutes. Bert Farragher, if you have a parade, you got to have some bands, somebody said. And Bert Farragher, He was the music director at the school then. So I says, well, I'll get a hold of Bert Farragher and have him bring bands in. And Bert did, and he did a wonderful job. He got every band in the entire area to come to that first Apple Festival. And it didn't cost us a penny. They came on their own. And of course, right away we knew, well, if all these bands come, they're bound to bring their parents. Their parents are bound to come, and watch their kids. So, gee, we were moving along pretty good. But we had not done a darn thing. We didn't even talk about the traffic that might be involved in this. Didn't even give it a thought. So, the day of the Apple Festival come, I remember Charles Diamond. I don't know if anybody remembers.
yeah.
Do you remember him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Charles Diamond, he was the county traffic officer at on that Sunday, and the first Apple Festival, that, as we know it today, was the last Sunday in September. But he was on duty that day, and he saw all these cars coming. So he says, I talked to him after he got into town. He says, I got in line with them, he says, to see what was going on. And when he got to town and saw the chaotic mess we had, he took over at the Standard Oil station, where right across from Joanne had the Standard Oil was there.
Kennedy's old place.
Yeah, Kennedy's old place. Artie Kennedy's old place. And he took over there. And he stopped all the traffic and got them headed south down to the waterfront. And of course, at that time, there was no bank building, there was no hardware store, no swimming pool. All those lots were wide open. So all the traffic went down there. What traffic there? There was quite a bit that first time, just the same. And we were all surprised. So all the traffic went down there. But neither had we done anything about publicity. We didn't even think about it. We just thought we'd run a few ads in the paper. But at that time, Irene Grunke and Grunke's handled the Chamber of Commerce work. She handled all the communications, and the office was there. And about the middle of September, I remember, I was in there talking to her about something, and a guy from Channel 6 happened to be there that day, talking to her. And we told him we were going to have this Apple Festival. And he says, well, what's it all about? So we lined it up, and he says, well, what can we do to help? And he says, all you have to do, he says, is to print up a sign, Bayfield Apple Festival, when it's going to be held and where. And he says, we will display that on the screen every so often for several days. And I said, well, what's that going to cost? And he says, it won't cost you a thing. He says, we'll do it as a public service.
Fantastic.
And that's how we got a lot of our advertising out. And I know I talked to some people afterwards, and they asked me, how did you ever get that on TV so fast? Well, it was just luck. It was just luck. But we didn't have a dime spent on advertising, parking, cleanup, or nothing. But you know but the thing that we didn't talk about, and what we realized afterwards, what we had really done was we had brought people to the apples. For years and years, the farmers were bringing the apples to the people by truck.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this was the real good thing that we did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But even the restaurants that day ran out of food. No one anticipated the crowd that showed up.
How many people do you think were in town?
I
Just take a
have-
wild guess.
I don't know, Bob. I know there was a lot of people. Everybody was impressed with that first one that we know today.
And what year was that?
62.
1962.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And then did it
He-
keep going
and, you know,
every year after
and-
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the parade wasn't too bad, as I remember. Quite a few farmers brought a wagon trailer with apples on, and there were a few floats, but all these bands, that really impressed a lot of people. We had all the high school bands.
It's been a tradition ever since.
Yeah.
I mean, the bands are the reason.
Yeah, but that is how that Apple Festival got going. The one that we know today.
Yeah. When did the mass band idea come around?
The what?
The mass band, when all the kids get together at the end.
Oh,
and play on-
that started with, what's his name? Used to live over on the corner.
Buck Franzen.
Buck Franzen. Yeah, he started the mass bands.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Probably he was in the 80s, maybe
yeah,
1980s, somewhere's in there.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that's how the Apple Festival got going.
Was he the guy that was also the projectionist down at the movie theater? It was a Bucky, somebody.
What was the question?
He asked if Buck Franzen was a movie projectionist person at the theater down there. For Buck, that would have been for Brub Walksmith, and he may have done that.
He may have done that, John. Now that you mention it.
when Wild Rose was shown, that was the last film ever shown in the movie theater down there.
Yeah,
There was a projectionist named Bucky.
that could have
remember
been
his
Buck
last
Franzen.
name.
That could have
But
been.
you could have been Buck. Before him was Bob Moran,
Yeah,
but Bob was gone by the time.
Yeah.
I believe he'd passed by the time you were here.
What was the movie theater's name again?
Harbor Theater.
The Harbor Theater.
yeah.
Where was the old Princess Theater, Dad?
In the Oddfellow building.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That would be another interesting story. Is John, down the road is the old opera houses and the buildings. When we talked about places of ill repute, the city of Bayfield has something like 7 or 8 different hotels in it, from the Island View to the Pageant to the Union to the Bayfield House and there's quite a few others too, and all of those, I think, had working corners at
Yeah.
It
times.
must have.
Yeah.
yeah.
You remember in the early 20s, the city of Bayfield had roughly 2,000 people nearing, when the mill closed, I think it was in 1925, the community had something like 2,400 to 2,500 people living here. There was a small community of people at Royce Point. There were a lot more people in the town of Russell, in the town of Bayfield,
Yeah.
the town of Bayview. They were pretty well filled up. So when you walk the streets of Bayfield now, we're looking at a Bayfield the size of Bayfield probably in 1870 right now with 600-700 people.
What do you think the peak population was in Bayfield?
I know it to be right around 24 to 2,500,
Okay.
and that's census type of
Yeah,
stuff.
and that was right around the turn of the century there. And of course, when you think about it, there had to be a few people in order to support 10 or 12 saloons.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There was a dozen of them. I know exactly where they were. I don't have mine.
Bob's got them pinpointed.
I've seen them in the I've seen it in the Bayfield Progresses in 1909, where I think there were 12 places in town, and they give you the lot and the and the block number and who they were. So I know there was a dozen bars in Bayfield
Yeah.
in 1909, and then it was down to 8 in 1914, and then they went into, like I say, prohibition here for 1 year. I don't know what happened after that because I haven't read 1916 yet, but that's really interesting. So it was quite the community.
Well, there were several blind pigs, what we call blind pigs, before prohibition, before FDR did away with prohibition.
Do you know where remember where those were? Excuse me.
Not really.
In the old community lunch, I know there was one.
Yes, in the basement.
Yeah, in the basement of the old community lunch. What the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Fred Benson used to say of that. They'd go down there and get all the moonshine they wanted. You know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there was a couple up on Sweet Hill too. There were houses.
Yeah. It's stills in them.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Well, you know, Julian, you've made reference a few times when I've talked to you before about the guy, the kind of master carpenter that built some houses in town here. Who was that?
One of the earliest of carpenters here in Bayfield was Andrew Tate. And then there was Andrew Tate had something to do with it, and then there was Captain T.J.L. Tyler. He was one of the earliest Bayfield people here, and where you see the streets and stuff right now, like on Broad Street, that was Ravine at one time, and Captain T.J.L. Tyler, who got here in I think in about 1860, he built all the trestles in town. Bayfield was a trestle city, and Washington Avenue was blocked off. It had a trestle across. The trestles were all over town, and that's what he did.
Yeah.
And I think Tyler also built the Tate Building, that's on the corner of it would be First Street and Penny there.
But there was some guy known for detail staircases or windows or something.
Theodore Ernst.
Oh yeah, Theodore.
Can you tell me about Theodore Ernst?
Yeah, that's the house down the street, block over. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's above George's oil station. It's got all the trimmings on, you know.
Behind the gas station there?
Yeah.
That, who's in there now?
I forget his name.
George Defoe's daughter is there now. Oh, but living in the house?
Yeah.
Oh.
Can't think of his name.
Yeah, I can't either.
Theodore Ernst died in 1944.
Yeah.
That's when he passed, and we've got some of his furniture at the home.
Did you know him well?
I just barely remember him.
Oh, you do? Okay, I thought you knew him well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you remember about old Henry Walksmith, Dad?
Well, I remember him walking a lot. Yeah, he liked to walk. Yeah.
He was a very old man. When I was going to the Lutheran church over there for confirmation, he was in his 90s then, and I was like, this would be 1963.
Yeah.
And he was walking then, but he was he's a pretty tough cookie in Bayfield's history.
Oh yeah, he played quite a role. Yeah. Yeah, they claim he saved the bank during the Depression when a lot of other banks went broke. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
His father was Henry Walksmith, who came from Bavaria, and they called him Whiskers Walksmith, and he was the town chairman in the town of Bayfield for many, many years. And then Henry took over as the Bayfield mayor in 1915, so his father actually built the Walksmith industry here. And Walksmith purchased all that property when R.D. Pike passed away in 1906 is when that big movement to the Walksmith family came in the ownership of the mills along the waterfront. And there were many mills down there that were owned by the Johnsons, and there was planing mills, there were shingle mills, there were all kinds of mills, and there were just loads and loads and loads and loads of white pine and hemlock that left here on some of the boats, the old steamers of the day. And there are a lot of photos down at BHA of those things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful history. Break.
All right, we'll take a break.
I worked for the ferry line, and I was there for about 18 years. And I met some real nice people while I was on that ferry. I mean, high-grade people. And I enjoyed the work there.
Are you taping now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the time, it was a pretty good job. Yeah.
Well, why did you work on the ferry?
Well, it was a job that I figured I could handle, and they needed someone, and Howard Russell approached me and asked me if I wanted to. I was out of the fishing, and
Why did you leave the fishing industry?
because you couldn't make a living at it.
Tell us what happened.
What happened? It's just another case of using a resource that went unregulated. That was the basic cause. And of course, in World War II, there was it. The country was on food stamps, gas rationing, and stuff like that. And if you suggested that the country produce less feed, can you imagine what the political implications of that would be? And so the industry just went wild, the fishing industry. I mean, anybody and his brother could get into it. The fish companies, they furnished you with a boat, nets. Nobody said no to anything. And so the lake just got way overfished, way overfished. And it's just another case of the lack of government.
So in 1962, that was it for you.
Yeah.
That 61 was your last year, and then in 62 you went to work for Howard Russell.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I did fish a little bit in '62 too, but in the first year I worked for Howard, it was just during the summer months. Yeah.
And you and Allison Batan were fishing chubs. I remember that.
Yeah, we were fishing a little bit in the fall and a little bit on the ice. But after that, there was no use. But it's just another case of no controls.
Tell me a little bit about Dad. You'd fish until you went into World War II.
Yeah.
I know that you went in there with some friends and stuff like that. Tell us a little bit about life here prior to World War II, and then tell us a little bit about Pearl Harbor, and then tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the whole thing, your age at that time and things.
Yeah. Well, of course, I didn't get into anything major. I got in more at the end of the war, and but Henry and I and
Little Henry Johnson and then
Henry Johnson, we got to talking once, and he says, let's join the Merchant Marine.
Little Henry said that to you?
Yeah. So we and he says Ed Erickson kind of wants to go too. So the three of us, we went to Duluth and applied for AB papers, and we got them, and then we went to Norfolk, Virginia, and we shipped out on a tanker, and we spent most of our time in the South Pacific. We went to the Persian Gulf, to a little place up the Tigris Euphrates, to a little town called Abadan in Iran that had a refinery, and took on a load of Bunker C, and went to the Mariana Islands down around Australia. I remember it took us 21 days steady steaming from the Persian Gulf to the Marianas. 11,000 miles.
Who'd you fuel there?
And we unloaded into one of Admiral Halsey's Navy tankers. And then we hauled oil, a couple loads out of South America to Sydney, Australia. Yeah, we were up in the northern part of New Guinea, the French part there called Hollandia. Yeah, we unloaded oil there.
You saw the world.
Oh yes, I saw a lot. I've seen a lot of the world.
You were in Tientsin, China?
Yeah, and then after that, I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and I spent 2 years in there. And my last duty there was in Tientsin, China. I spent 8 months there. Of course, that was after the war was over. And
But you were at Guam. You were.
Oh yes, I spent 8 months in Guam.
What was your purpose there?
We were training for the invasion of Japan, but the war ended when I was on Guam.
What were you in the? You were in the United States Marine Corps.
Yeah.
What division?
3rd Division. 3rd Division, Pioneer Battalion. But then I was discharged from the 1st Division because by that time the 3rd had. Yeah.
Did the 3rd Division disassemble then?
Yeah, they must have.
Yeah.
Because when I got discharged, I was in the 1st Division from Tientsin.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So So Guam to Tinson,
Yeah,
and then home again?
yeah.
How about your trip? Where did you arrive when you got home?
In Dago, San
Yes.
Diego. I was discharged at Camp Pendleton in San Diego.
And who met you there?
Whom? Nobody.
That was Norman and Rex.
Oh yeah, well yeah, they were living there. But I had an interesting conversation in Tinson. I was a dispatcher for motor transport battalion. We've furnished all the trucks and jeeps for the division there, and the place that we inhabited was a compound that before the war had been used by Chrysler Motor Company for the assembling of Dodge cars, and the man in charge there used to come by once in a while and talk to us, and I guess he was anxious for the war to end so he could get back in there. But anyway, he was telling us that he had a Chinese woman that did his housework, and she would come to his house regular to do his housework, and he became very familiar with her. But one day, and she, by the way, she said she had been converted to Catholicism. She was a devout Catholic. But one day, he said he had an occasion and he had to go to her home, and he said when he got there, here was a statue of Buddha on her table, and he said he pointed to it, and he asked her, he says, I thought you were a devout Catholic, that you had been converted. And she says, well, I have been converted, she says, but she says, if I don't have that there, I won't have any luck. Yeah, now that's a true story too, by this American citizen.
Dad, tell us a little bit about Guam.
Guam?
What was a day in Guam like in World War II?
A lot of rain.
Yeah.
A lot of rain. A lot of marching. A lot of marching.
Was there was there a fever pitch there where the guys? I can't imagine they'd be anxious to go to Japan and invade Japan.
No.
Tell us what the feeling.
There wasn't much talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody talked about it much.
Yeah.
The food was good. A lot of Australian mutton. Yeah.
You never eaten mutton since, have you?
Yeah. There's a difference between lamb and mutton.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're in Guam 8 months.
Yeah.
So a lot of marching.
Aganya is the name of the city. Yeah.
Was that you were there during the period in time where the boys were at Iwo Jima? Had they already gone to Iwo Jima when you were there?
I think they had taken care of Iwo then. Yeah.
And they were. I know that my father-in-law was on on the USS Benson at that time, and they were escorting the aircraft carriers along the shoreline of Japan. Yeah. And I wondered, you never got into you stopped at Guam and that was it.
Yeah.
So you never got involved in direct combat?
No,
Yeah.
never got into any combat.
Well, that was good.
No.
Yeah.
No. Never.
What was your thoughts when they set the atomic bomb, Dad?
Well, we really didn't know too much about the atomic bomb. We learned about it afterwards, but we just heard about this splitting of the atom and the creation of that atomic bomb. And of course then we read about its destructive power and all that.
Did you read about it that in the paper that they actually bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki then?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I imagine, was there a
Yeah.
sigh of relief amongst the guys?
Oh,
or?
I'm sure there was, yeah, you bet. Nobody wanted to go there. No.
The truth be known.
If the truth be known, no.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been pleasant. I know that.
No. No. Yeah.
So you're back. You're back from Tinson in 1946. You get back here.
Yeah, and I went fishing.
Yeah. And then you bought you bought John Nelson's rig?
No, I bought that before I went out.
Okay, 19,
38, I bought that.
and that included all the fishing nets, plus the boat, the Best Suzanne, that was built in
Yeah.
1935.
Yeah.
From there, you go to war, and then you come back in a 1947 or 46. Is that when you buy the Mermaid from Billy Vano?
Yeah, in the fall of 46.
Tell me about that, Julian, the Mermaid.
Well, that was a boat that Billy Vano had built in Cornucopia. She was a 45-foot boat, yeah. And when I got back, it was just in time for herring season. Yeah, so I got the boat and I fished herring that fall with it.
What'd you have to pay for the Mermaid at the?
5,000.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, at that time, yeah.
Did you have it in cash, or did you have to borrow it?
No, I had it in cash. Yeah. And when I bought my father out in 38, he charged me 2,000 for the rig, and I had that in cash.
What did you do with the Best Suzanne then?
She went to the North Shore.
Who'd you sell it to?
A guy by the name of John Miller.
John Miller. Was he an old Bayfield boy, or?
Well, yeah, he was a guy that your grandfather knew. He'd fished for Grandpa.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So John Miller bought the Best Suzanne, went to the North Shore.
Yeah.
Then it wound up back in Cornucopia.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah.
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 And you fished the Mermaid until you sold it to Ellis in Bataan
Yeah.
in 1961 or 62, one of those years.
It's somewhere's in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Mermaid was the only boat you fished out of then after the war, till you quit.
Yeah. That's the only one. Yeah. Well, I only fished. Well, I fished out of 3 boats, but 2 of them were my father's. Yeah. The Twin was the first one, which was built in 1920, and that's where I started my fishing. Yeah, in that boat.
But when John bought out Hans Austa,
Yeah.
John bought all the nets and I've got at home, the old letting hammer there.
Yeah.
He bought all his gear out, plus he bought the boat, the store boat.
Store boat. That was an open boat.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
would it probably may have been a Mackinac before then, because if John bought that rig in 1909,
Yeah.
that was the name of the first boat he bought, was a store boat.
Yeah.
Then he had the Twin built. Who built the Twin?
John Peterson on Madeline Island.
And John was a local boat builder from the island. Did John Peterson build other boats in Bayfield?
Oh yes, he built the Motor B2, Benson's, and other boats.
Yeah.
Yeah, he built quite a few others. Yeah.
There's other boat builders in Bayfield.
Yeah.
Avon Christensen, Frank Mulkey.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Avon Christensen.
Well, Avon was a very good boat builder. He was a real craftsman, but he never had much for tools. But he could do wonders with a saw, handsaw, a plane, and an axe. And
Never a better man, eh?
And never a better man. He was miraculous. Yeah, he had an eye that when he sunk that axe into the keel or stem or whatever he was hewing out, it counted.
Tell us a little bit more about Avon. He came from Mo i Banen, Norway.
Yeah, northern Norway. He married one of my sisters. Yeah. Yeah, but he was a real craftsman. Yeah.
What boats did he build that you can recall?
Well, he built the Nancy Lee. He built Martin Erickson's Marianne, Linus Jacobson's South Twin, Mike Hendrickson's Bobby, or Robert Lee, Noring's boat. What was that? Bobby, was it?
Yeah, that's the Bobby.
Yeah. He built, let's see.
Did he build any Sand Island boats like the Dorothea or anything like that?
No, Olaf Edwards built the Dorothea. Yeah, but he built the Nancy Lee for Elvis.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Olaf Edwards built some boats.
Olaf built a lot of fish boats, yeah. And of course Frank Mulkey built quite a few boats too.
So Olaf Edwards did a nice job. He was a.
Yeah.
I read in just recently that in 1914 he built the Northland.
Yeah. Yeah. He had a couple of boats named the Northland. Yeah. They were all Mackinac boats that he built.
Then the North Cape.
I think that boat was built by John Peterson on the island.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, wasn't Mulkey Marie's
Yeah.
father?
Yeah. Yeah. Mulkey built the best Suzanne. He built.
Lily Mae.
The Lily Mae, Jackie's boat, or Marty's boat.
Built the Knife Isle.
Several boats went to the North Shore.
The Willie for Otto Kuntz.
Yeah, and a couple of boats for the Bodines. Yeah.
Adolf Badin.
Adolf and Elmer.
What do you remember the name of them boats?
No,
They're there. The Clipper.
the Clipper. Yeah,
I remember the boat, the Clipper.
That was Elmer's boat.
Yeah, and Elmer sold that to Bud Badin's dad there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in the end, so Frank Mulkey, John Peterson, Avon Christensen, Olaf Edwards
Yeah, they were the boat builders.
in Bayfield from the period of about 1910 to
Yeah,
I want to say 1950.
yeah.
And where were their shops? Where did they work out of?
Well, Frank Mulkey had his shop down where the swimming pool is. There used to be a house and a shop on the north end of that property, right next to George's bulk station there.
And bulk tanks and stuff.
Bulk
Yeah.
tanks, yeah. And that's where he built them. Oh.
Where did Olaf build his boats?
There used to be a shed down at Bodines between, pretty much on the lake, between Halverwrighton's Railway and Bodines. There was a herring shed there that was used by Hadlin, putting up herring, and that was used as Avon built boats there, and Olaf built boats there.
Did they each one have to say a dibs on it for one winter or something? Usually they spent one winter building a boat, didn't they?
Just about, yeah.
Do you remember what they paid in? I remember Mom talking to me about Frank,
Yeah.
saying that he would work for like 45 cents an hour. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, yes. It runs in my mind, 1935, when he built the best Suzanne for my dad. It just seems to me that he worked for $3 a day. Yeah. Can you imagine that?
He built the Dis and Dot. Remember that?
Yeah.
For Art Crone.
For Art Crone, yeah.
Tell that story about Art.
Oh,
The naming of the boat.
the naming of the boat. Well, Art was getting pretty anxious, to get the boat in the water. So he when they were getting close to the end, he says, "Well, Frank," he says, "how much have we got left to do on this boat?" And Frank says, "Oh, a little bit of Dis and a little bit of Dot," and that's how it became the Dis and Dot.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and I heard later on that Frank was quite miffed because, Frank was from Germany,
Yeah.
and he couldn't say this or that. There
Yeah.
was dis or dat,
Yeah.
and it was, and it was kind of like a direct slam at him for his,
Yeah.
inability to speak, clear and
Yeah.
concise
Yeah.
English. So
Yeah.
quite a story.
A little bit of Dis and a little bit of Dot.
Yeah. Who built the Viking, Dad, for Irv Hadlin?
Well, that boat, Manny Batan brought that boat up from down below someplace. It was not built in Bayfield.
How about the Red Wing? Do you remember the Red Wing?
Oh, that's one of Art Crone's boats from Madeline Island.
That'd probably be a John Peterson boat, maybe?
No, Art Crone.
Art Crone built that himself.
Either Art or Arvid. Arvid, I think, was the boat builder.
So there's another boat builder in the area, Arvid Crone.
Yeah.
Did Arvid build the Halifax? Remember the Halifax?
Emil Eriksson. built it.
Emil Eriksson built that, so there's another boat builder.
Yeah.
Emil.
Emil did an awful lot of work on the wooden Gerhow
Oh, I see.
when Howard built that.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
he was a neat guy.
Yeah, he was different.
Yeah. I'm thinking of other boats now. They're starting to pop in. How about the Chinook? Who built that, Dad?
The Chinook?
Yeah.
I wonder if that wasn't built by John Peterson on the island for Seaburger.
For Seaburger.
Yeah.
But then the LaPointe brothers owned it, right?
And the Point, but and I know that John Peterson built the Lola. Yeah.
For Carly Myers.
It was for he built it and it was left over on the island for some time, and then Elmore Fish Company finally bought it.
What was Elmore's name?
Elmore? Howard Elmore.
Howard Elmore. What year did he come here?
Oh, late 20s, and he was here till the early 30s. Well, he was one of the guys that went really busted in the
Depression.
in the Big Depression.
So
Yeah.
he had the Lola built,
Yeah,
and I remember what Carly Myers owning that?
yeah, and Wilford.
Wilford Peterson.
Yeah,
Who built the Ione?
Mulkey and Avon.
So they had a dual operation
Yeah.
there. The Ione. What about the Dawn? Les Cornell's boat.
Yeah, well, that came up from down below.
So that had a Cullenberg in it?
And that had a 3-cylinder, 3-banger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See him. Now my mind is really scanning. I'm looking down the harbor as I see him. The Noopy, Dad. Remember the Noopy?
Noopy, yeah. That was Henry Johnson's boat, and that was built by Olaf Edwards. That was one boat that he put a fantail on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How'd they get the name Noopy?
From Nunn and Pitt.
Nunny and...
Yeah.
That's a
They
good
were in the
story.
fish business. They ran the LaPointe fish dock. And they called Ernest Nunn, and the other brother was Pitt. So they took the first syllables from each name, and it became the Noopy.
That's a funny story. Nunny and Pitt,
Yeah,
what a wonderful guy, Ernie. Nunny is actually Ernie LaPointe.
yeah.
Right.
And his brother...
I don't know how he got the name Nunn, but... Nunn,
Dad, can you tell me the time that you had the mermaid off of Madeline Island and you were running in the frost smoke fishing herring there, and the Chinook took you out?
It wasn't the Chinook.
Or-
It was the Seabird.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was a very cold December day, and there was a lot of frost smoke, and you know what frost smoke is, just a heavy fog. You couldn't see 2 feet in front of you, and we were running north, and the Seabird was running east, and we met, and he smashed right into the bow of the Mermaid and broke everything right down to the water line. But we didn't take on any water. But
Lucky she was a newer boat.
oh yeah, she was a brand new boat. Yeah, well, she was.
You were on the north. You were on the Hagen Bank.
Yep.
That'd be on the northeast side of Madeline Island.
Right. Yeah.
In about
and we had been looking for the buoy, and of course in that smoke we couldn't find it. So we decided we were going to run up to Big Bay, and lay there till the frost smoke cleared, and that's what put us on that northerly course. And the Seabird always left half an hour after everybody else left from Bayfield, so she was on an easterly course, and she just hit us like that at full speed. And of course,
You had to come back to town.
yeah, we came back to town, and I got Mulkey down there, and we put a patch on it, put something in the hole, and then nailed a heavy piece of sheet iron on, and we finished the season.
And then you pull her up at Hulver's and had her work done.
And then we pulled her up at Halvers, and he did the repair job during the winter.
Who built the boat, the Ruth, Dad?
Oh, that was Avon.
Avon Christensen
Yeah,
boat.
yeah.
And the Ruth was owned by the Johnsons.
No, the Ruth was Henry's boat.
Little Henry's.
Yeah, yeah.
Henry who?
Henry Johnson. Yeah, he was one of my good friends. He graduated from high school with me, same age, a few months younger, but
Dad graduated in the class in 1934 from Lincoln High School. So they were all classmates.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
Ruth. What was the name of the boat that Henry Johnson Sr. had?
Well,
Do you remember?
He had the Noopy built, yeah, and then he also had a tug. That was before my time, the tug Fashion.
I remember the Fashion.
Do you?
There's photos of it around.
Yeah. Well, he owned Henry's dad owned the Fashion for a while.
Would you tell the story, Dad, about John Nelson fishing herring on the old tugs before they had the gill net lifters? Didn't he used to tell you about how mad
yeah. Yeah, those nets were pulled by hand, and I don't know how they did it. And I asked him, I said, "Well, when the nets were that full of herring, how did you get a hold of them?" Well, he says they used to wrap their arms right around like this, and they would walk across the deck with them. Of course, they came up over a roller on the outside of the boat, but that's how they lifted herring nets.
Well, Booth in those days had, when he worked for Booth, they had a boat by the name of the R.W. Curry
Yeah.
and
Anderson.
and the Tug Anderson. And I got a photo at home of it, and I wish Uncle Fred was here because he knew everybody in that photo.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's one of the boats I would believe that John Nelson would have worked on. And what some of those guys did in those days was this, is they used to set the nets, the herring were that thick, where they'd set the nets, and they'd lay on the inside end net, and the next day they'd lift them at dawn the next day. Now, I don't know if John got in on that, but in the old days, there was a lot of friction between the captains. The captains were always in a tuxedo, weren't they, Dad, or something?
Not that I know of, but well, you know, they probably had a few advantages, but
the bottom line is when they grabbed a hold of the buoy and the rock come up from the bottom and the net started and the herring started, if the captain of the tug wasn't paying attention, if that boat would drift off, then out would go all those herring.
Yeah.
And the crew would become quite irate.
Yeah.
If they had to redo that. And they were talking 15 ton of herring.
Yeah.
On a lift.
Sure.
And they'd bring them back to Bayfield, then they'd bring them to the herring sheds where they would be, the fish should be washed, and they'd have 15 dressers there. They'd cut the heads off and back split them and salt them there. And all those fish in those days, John, went to the miners in the West Virginia.
Really?
Coal miners, yeah.
That was where they were at with this whole thing. So, and later on it became mink feed, and now it's one of the premier fish fry foods you can get in the Bayfield area is to have fresh herring. Bar none, it's the best in the business. So, here comes dear sister Heidi. So,
oh,
all right, I'll take a pause.
I'm going to pick some names out of the pile here.
Oh.
And I want you to tell me a little bit what you know. The person that comes to my mind is Solly Batan.
Solly Batan?
Do you remember him?
I remember him well. And he was a non-religious man. And he was very outspoken. But honest as the day is long. And he used to, down on Grunky's Corner, there used to be a building there, and it was called the Pageant Inn. And Mrs. Wilson used to provide sleeping and boarding facility there for teachers and other people. And Solly was one of the people who stayed there and ate there. And he'd get into discussions with the school teachers up there. Yeah.
All Presbyterians.
It's all Presbyterians. Yeah. And well, he let them know that he didn't believe much in that religion. And so this one teacher, her name was Dorothy Vickery. Yeah. And she was kind of a goody-goody type. And she asked him, "Well, Mr. Batan, if you don't believe in heaven and hell, just what do you believe in?" "Well," he says, "I'll tell you, lady." He says, "If there is such a place as heaven and hell, I'd just love to run my tugboat between them two places." That was Solly Batan.
Solly Batan was 4 years old when he came here with the Bataan family in 1870.
Yeah.
And his father was Solomon Sr. And Solly he was the originator of Bataan and Mahan fisheries. And his particular fishing dock would be about where Wilson Avenue intersects with First Street there, and it ran towards Madeline Island. And there's some real nice photos of that operation there. And his boats were the Nelson B
Yeah.
and Elsie Nell and the RT Roy.
Yeah. Elsinell and R.T. Roy, those were Solly's boats.
And he also had a boat named the Superior.
Oh,
A tug named the Superior.
That was before my time.
But they were all the steam engines,
Yeah.
and they were. I think the rats wouldn't live on them. So in those days it was pretty raucous down there, and there was a lot of type of thing, and they were gone. The rats would not stay on them. I heard they were pretty tough shape. Some of the boats, at least at the end. Do you remember the Herring King at all?
No, I don't remember, but I remember hearing stories about her, but I don't remember the boat. Do you remember what the year it burned? It should be someplace.
I think it was like 22 or 23, somewheres in there. Yeah.
Oh,
And there was a life lost on that too.
yeah.
But Solly Bataan was a big time fisherman in Bayfield, and they came from, that big time Bataan fishing name, and that family. They were very, very instrumental. The Bataan family in the original days of Bayfield. Do you remember Jacob Johnson, Dad?
I don't remember him, but I know who he was. Yeah.
That would be Jimmy Edwards' grandfather,
Or
and great grandfather.
great grandfather. That's, yeah.
Jimmy Edwards' grandmother was Jenny, and she was the daughter
A daughter.
of Jacob Johnson.
Yeah,
and
she
they
and Mrs. Hanson.
yeah,
sister.
Mrs. Fred Hanson.
Mrs. Fred Hanson, yeah.
So that's their history here. But Jacob and Solly Bataan were partners in that business down there at one time too,
Yeah.
at the foot of First Street there, about
It's about where the marina is.
where the marina is right now. So
Yeah.
there was a big dock that went out there in those
Yeah.
days that are long
Yeah,
gone.
and that's the dock I remember, and that's the dock that Solly operated off.
When did that burn, or what happened to it? Did they
I
just
don't
knock
know.
it down, or?
I don't know. I don't remember just what happened to that. I don't know if they. I just don't know.
Then right next to that was La Pointe Fisheries.
Yeah.
Who owned that before Nunny and Pitt? That picture shows right back in right around 1900, Dad. That building being there with all the sawmills. But that's a real interesting little section of town.
When I was a kid, Wilson Avenue, there was no street there at all. All there was vacant land loaded with pine and hemlock bark on Wilson that ran east and west there. Yeah, that's all there was there.
Do you remember the trestles at all down there, Dad?
I just barely remember the trestle that ran along the lake shore. And I do remember the lumber piles on the east dock.
Do you remember any of the buildings that were there along the waterfront? They'd burned by then?
Yeah. No.
That whole waterfront from about where Penny Avenue is south, that was all pretty much filled in by the flood, Dad?
Yeah. Oh, an awful lot of sand went down there.
Would Badine's property be, where Badine's property is right there?
Yeah.
That's the old Elmore place. That's the
Yeah.
same old Otto L. Keene Fish Company in the 50s.
Yeah.
Is that sitting on solid ground, or is that on slab?
Oh, I think there's a lot of slabs there. Yeah, I think so. Because that's all the way all those docks were built.
So I wonder if the building itself is sitting on slabs.
Well, the building was probably on piling. They must have drove piling there.
So that's basically in Lake Superior.
Yeah.
At one point in time, the beach line along Bayfield went up along where Wilson Avenue is.
That could very well be, yeah.
So, that all filled in over the years. The same thing where the old Vaughn dock is, That would be the north. That would be a dock on the north side of where the ferry boat landing is
Yeah,
right
I
now.
remember that. We used to play on that when we were kids, but it was rotten then.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is that where the dock where the old Christopher Columbus
that could be.
landed there in
Yeah.
1899? She
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah, that could very well be.
But where the ferry boat landing is right now, the old photos show that water line going up at least another 100 feet.
Yeah,
Because I've seen photos there
yeah,
where the Booth fishery boats.
yeah. That's right.
What was the name of the tug that sunk out there off of Wilson? It's on the bottom there. She was taking a load of hay to the islands of
Oh,
lumber camp.
yeah, at the camp.
Yeah, the tug camp. It shows her, John, right up nose on the beach there with all the Mackinaws, about 100 feet inward from where the.
Well, when you look at that new building that the Fairline built,
Yeah,
on the north and west end of it, in
Yeah.
the corner, there used to be a sliding door on that old building.
I remember that.
Yeah, and that's where they unloaded fish from the Turner, and I remember the Turner laying right alongside that door. Now, go down and look at it now, and God, you're 50 feet inland.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So that whole waterfront is really filled in.
that really filled in.
In the earliest of days, that's where one of the old fountains used to be in Bayfield,
Yeah,
right at the head of Washington Avenue there. When they staked that property, that's probably where the first stake in Bayfield was on the corner of Washington Avenue, and they ran true east and west. And right in there, they said that was the spot where the first fountain in Bayfield was. Had that, and they used to raise brook trout right in Washington Avenue there in its earliest of days. And there were something like 11 fountains in Bayfield.
that could be.
One
Yeah.
up there by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And others all over town.
It used to be called the Fountain City.
Yeah.
He did.
Yep.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Harbor City, Fountain City.
What
Yeah.
happened to all those fountains?
Well, I don't know. I think they just shut them off.
Well, just a few years ago, on the one that would be across from the old Frank Patan building there where that new house was
Yeah.
put in, part of the deal there is that fountain near the Catholic Church was supposed to remain there.
Yeah,
And that got filled in.
yeah.
And I don't know the rest of the story.
No.
But that's where one of the old Bayfield fountains was. There was one that is, there's a fountain in back of where Isaac Wing's building is where the funeral home used to be, which is now a bed and breakfast. There was a fountain right there. I know of those 4 fountains in Bayfield for sure. So, those are really the interesting days. The
Yeah.
Tug Camp.
Yeah.
Tell that story about the camp, Dad.
Well, I can only tell you the way my father told it to me. And that boat, that tug had been to Ashland to take on a load of hay, and she was going to Stockton to the lumber camp at where Ganyas are.
Okay.
Yeah. And there was a heavy northwest wind.
Who was logging that? Was that Stearns or
I don't know if it was Schrader or who.
probably was Schrader Logging Company
Yeah,
at
it
Presqu'île?
But I think it was Schrader that built that dock.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mean Ganyas?
At Ganyas.
Yeah.
When
That-
when would this be?
1900.
No, early 1900s.
Okay.
Very early 1900s.
I see the camp in a picture in about 1905.
Yeah.
So
But-
she's tied there. So a little
But
bit after
anyway, they had all this hay piled on deck, according to my father, and she got into this rough sea broadside, and the tug laid over, and the load shifted on the deck of the camp, way over to the starboard side, and of course the tug could not come back against that shift of weight, and she filled with water and down she went. Yeah.
The hay was going to feed the horses.
Yeah, the hay was going to feed the horses on Stockton. Yeah, and the Park Service, and I've seen the photos that they have of her, and you can see whoever it was did a good job. she's sitting down there. It looks like she's sitting on her keel, and you could see camp on the back. The
Yeah.
name camp.
It was the TH camp.
Yeah.
He must have been a booth boy or something.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the Park Service has made a what do you call it?
National site out of it or something.
No, they got a tape on it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
A movie.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. They got a tape on it, and I used it once, and I looked at it.
I bet you the camp was one of the boats too. That used to be a fish pickup boat in the islands too.
Sure.
So there
She was a fish tug.
Yeah.
She was one of the tugs that Booth fished, and she fished off of Willie's Island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right around then.
Yeah.
And that's and Willie's Island at the turn of the century was John Duva
Yeah.
and little old Henry Johnson
Yeah.
and that gang. So
Yeah.
she was out there all the time. Charlie Benson was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, an interesting group of guys.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about Charlie. Was he? Did they like Charlie Benson?
Well, Charlie was a real gentleman. A real gentleman. Never heard him say a bad word. Yeah.
Was he a good
Yeah.
fisherman?
He was a good fisherman, a hard worker. He came from the old country. He was an old-time sailor. He sailed on the sailboats, climbed the rigging out on the
In the North Sea?
in the North Sea, yeah, and then came to Bayfield. Yeah, he was one of the early Norwegians.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the originators of the Lutheran Church. Yeah, he one of the founders, I should say. Yeah, of the
Peter Miller,
Peter Muller.
Elsie Miller's father was
yeah.
one of them.
Yeah,
The Millers came here in about 1878
Yeah.
to Bayfield. The Norwegian influx started, to my knowledge, the first person that was here was either Peter Muller or a guy by the name of Olsen. And they were the first Norwegians here. And then in 85 came Hans Austen.
yeah,
And you'll see allusions to those guys here. But Peter Muller was one of the guys, along with Magnus Halvorsen,
Yeah.
that built the Raspberry School. And to this day, up at the Lincoln School up there, in the files are the credits to them for building the Raspberry School.
Was it Magnus or Pete?
It was Magnus in those days.
In the
This was in 1896. They built the Raspberry School.
uh-huh.
So, and I don't remember, but you see in 1906 in the plot books that Magnus Halvorsen, Pete Halvorsen, August Lohman,
Yeah.
all those guys were living in the town of Russell now, and there were no roads out to there. The major road that went through Bayfield went up through the cemetery here, John, and up to where Hauser's Corner is there, and it went straight up past Hauser's Superior View Farm, and went straight to the Four Corners. It didn't have the Turner Road or anything like that. It was the old established stagecoach trail. And
Yeah, but I remember my dad telling me about he and Pete Halvorsen. They worked and this was before he was married, so it had to be right around 1900. That they worked in a lumber camp up around Herbster, and they just quit. They said he says that they didn't want to work under those conditions because I guess that room that they slept in, that was something else. Yeah. They hung their
in the camp.
yeah, in the camp. They everybody hung their socks up at night and around that wood stove, and I guess that was something else. But anyway, he and Pete, they decided that they'd had enough. And they started out for Bayfield. And he says they came across the country out here, but they came out about where the fish hatchery is.
Sure. That
was the route, but he said it was a day in March, and he remembers it plain. He said there was a real hard crust on the snow, and he says they walked on top of that crust, and he says they walked it in a very short time, but they hiked it across, and they came out at the fish hatchery.
In that period in time, the roads to Bayfield, the roads to Bayfield were as follows. There was that road that went from Bayfield down Salmo Hill, past the fish hatchery, along the creek, and up towards Wichita's, and down the Butterfield Road. There was no road at that point in time you're talking about
Yeah.
to Cornucopia. That wasn't
No.
completed yet.
No.
So they either came in on the Battle Axe Road, they're up in the Battle Axe area, they take the Battle Axe down to that road
Yeah.
and into Bayfield. The second road teed off down by the hatchery and went across Pikes Creek over to the Onion River. And then it went to the Friendly Valley Road. And that Friendly Valley Road went all the way back for about 1.5 miles to the top of where the Sioux River crosses, and that went into the city of McClellan, which is now presently Washburn. So the roads around here were very, very different than they were now. And there's great allusions to that with the people that took care of that road. And the road that was even previous and prior to that, John, was one that goes way, way back, which is an Indian Tote Road. And that started at Pig Eye Island in St. Paul. And that was called the Bayfield St. Croix Trail. And that went from Pig Eye across the river up to, what's the name of Taylor's Falls, the one just before that on the, not Hudson, but,
Oh yeah, what is that town? Starts with O.
not Osceola, but it was in that area.
Osceola? Okay.
Yeah, well, anyway, it started down there and it went to St. Croix Falls and went up through Grantsburg, through the Creeks Meadows. I've got the map of it at home, an original map of about 1870, and it goes up towards Danbury. And then it cuts across in Douglas County and over across into Bayfield County in the township of Barnes. And then heads north through the islands there, through the lake areas, and it winds up at what they call the meadowlands or the pasture lands or that area, which is basically the Muckwa Barrens. And from Muckwa, it went north and into Bayfield and up through the Butterfield Road into the backside of Bayfield, down the Wichita property. We're talking about the road that your father walked on now, and then into Bayfield, and it ends up in the old military road in Bayfield.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's a real story within itself, and there are great texts about the prices to keep it clean and who got the contracts located at Bayfield Heritage Association too. I've got all that documented. It's the most fun period in time, from about 1856 to about 1880. So the St. Croix Trail was a very significant trail. It's an old Indian War trail, tote trail. That's the one that that's the same trail that William Knight came to Bayfield in 1869 on with Jim Chapman. So December 24th, 1869, he got here, and he talks about it in there, well, how tough it was coming up on those sleighs in those days. So
Yeah.
enough for now.
Julian, did you ever ride the train up here?
Oh, sure.
Tell me about that.
The train. That's
What the train is like.
Sure. That's the only way you could. In the wintertime, that was the only way you could get in and out of Bayfield, and it was the late 20s when the first plow came to Bayfield. And I remember we were all kids, and we're out there watching this plow. It was a rotary plow, and it came up 13, and we were out where Dick Carrier lives.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and we were watching it coming through, and that had to be in the late 20s. But before that, we took the train. I rode the train several times. We never had a car, but once in a while, my mother or dad would take us to Ashland, but very seldom.
When they got married, Dad, they didn't take the train to Washburn.
No.
But didn't they go down there to have their wedding photos or something?
Yeah, that's another story. 1903 in January, my dad and there were 6 people in his wedding party. Jesus, I wish I'd have kept that picture of them. You talk about some good-looking women in those days. There were some beauties.
Yeah.
Anyway, there were 6 people, and they hired a team from the livery stable downtown. And
That'd be Aikens or?
that would be where the egg toss is now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he says they went to Washburn in that sleigh, and it took them all day. He said they started out early in the morning. They got to Washburn, had their all the pictures taken, and it was dark when they got home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder who owned that livery stable down there. I know that in the beginning, the Druliard family owned a livery
Yeah.
stable, and then I want to say the Nelson,
R.J. Nelson was involved in it at one time.
yeah, and then there's Aiken.
Yeah, well, Aiken had the blacksmith shop.
Yeah.
On the north side of that. Yeah.
So it's probably from one of those three people that they
Yeah.
rented that sleigh for the day
Yeah.
to get their photos.
Yeah.
Did you?
And it was a real nice photo, you know.
Big one.
6 people. Yeah.
Names on it and everything?
I don't know if I don't know.
Well, it had to be
but
somebody.
I know there was. Yeah, I think Ed Moe was one of the. Yeah.
Ed and Mrs. Moe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a photo of them at home, but
Uh-huh.
so they're probably all from the Norwegian Lutheran
Oh,
Church.
sure.
They were members of the church. It could be no other way.
There'd be no other way because they were married in the church here in Bayfield.
Yeah.
Were your parents tolerant of other religions, Dad?
No. I don't have to think about it. No.
Well, there was
There was-
the Norwegian Lutherans and the Swedish Lutherans. They
Yeah.
didn't get along, right?
Yeah. And of course, they couldn't tolerate a Catholic at all.
No.
No.
No way.
No way.
Yeah.
It was I remember the story that when my grandmother used to see the Catholic priest coming,
Yeah.
that she would close the blinds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember the story about my grandfather saying, he said, you know, the Catholics, he says, they're such good people, he says, but he says, the priest, he said, he should know better. He's a learned man. So that's a true story, isn't it, Dad?
Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, and I know even the intolerance from my mother's side of the family,
Yeah.
in that the Mulkey side, and my grandmother came from Copenhagen,
Yeah.
and over there, they used to tease people with red hair.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you weren't blonde and you had red hair, you were an outcast. I mean, that's the type of prejudices and stuff that we had to overcome, and you guys had to overcome as kids to be where you're at this day and age. So there was no room for anybody other than Norwegian Lutheran.
Yeah.
And in those days, probably if you weren't an evangelical Lutheran,
Yeah.
you were an outcast too.
Yeah.
You were.
There was no tolerance there at all. So we've come a long way since then.
We hope so.
We hope so.
We're still learning.
Yeah. Yeah. There's still a lot to learn.
So do you remember, Dad? You know the. Do you remember the Bayfield Peninsula Fruit Company?
Yeah.
And do you remember the berries and stuff being shipped out of here in the summer times?
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about.
Well,
That was Doug Knight's operation.
No, Doug was in the cannery.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the bean operation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the fruit operation that was different. That was a co-op towards the end, and they shipped a lot of berries. Yeah, and Booth used to fill those cars with ice, keep for those berries. Yeah.
There's a. This is probably an interesting piece of history because there's a fruit and berry industry here that's been around since probably 1909, 1906, in that period of time. The first person that is known as the.
I gotta.
Take another.
I gotta go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Make it okay?
Yeah.
Well, let's take a break.
Move that chair.